Hi everybody, Dr. Jensen here. So we're going to continue with Sampling and Survey Research Basics Part 2. I think we left off about here, simple random samples. So use these whenever possible because they minimize and often eliminate bias. Simple random samples we sometimes call SRSs. These are the gold standard of surveys. So random sample allows for an opportunity for every member of a population an equal chance of being selected. So they're highly representative of people in the population. We love that. So how do you do that? You can use a random number generator. You can find this in SPSS. We're not going to do that a whole lot in this class, but you can. You can do it in Microsoft Excel or SAS or a lot of other software, or you can use a random number generator. Random.org or randomizer.org are two very popular ones. So if you need to kind of do a random selection process, use those links. So simple random samples, that's kind of the one we always use. Strengths and weaknesses. Number one, it minimizes bias and simplifies the analysis of the results. So many statistical analyses are made possible because you have a simple random sample. It should be the closest resemblance of the population, highly accurate. The weaknesses are it's not going to be perfect, no sample is. If you're truly interested in a subpopulation, your simple random sample may not adequately obtain enough of that subgroup. So let's say you want to make sure you have good coverage for people who are Native American. Maybe you want to do good coverage across the gay community or the elderly or maybe people who are low income. Often these groups tend to live in group environments together or in certain areas. They kind of clump up a little bit because they find similar cultures and identities. So if they're not evenly distributed across the population, you might not get enough of them in your sample because they just aren't, really having the best chance of being selected. So we have other techniques to deal with that later that can include enough of those groups in there so that way you get good coverage. Because if you don't have enough people in that group, you're not going to be able to analyze them because you can't let 10 Native Americans represent all Native Americans. That's just not enough people to be able to generalize. Cluster samples. This is like taking one group and splitting it, another group splitting it, another group splitting it. So we study a pre-existing group or a cluster. So we often do this with time periods. In the first stage of a sample, and then in a second stage, you split it again within those areas. So we actually kind of divvy up the clusters. So think of it as like peeling back an onion, going from the outside, splitting again, now the inner layers, and then you finally get to the core onion. So it's kind of working within a cluster. And there are certain little characteristics that happen. So in time periods, maybe you study a month, and then you split it into weeks, you split it into days, you split it into hours. That would be a cluster sample. There are a few other ways to do clusters. Maybe you start with a family and then you break it down into siblings and then you break it down into one child. So you could actually kind of split. They really should call these split sampling because that's more of what they're like. Strengths and weaknesses of clusters. It adds some variety to your estimates depending on how the clusters differ between themselves for what you want to look at. It helps reflect the population in a meaningful way, especially if they kind of are grouped with some binding tie, or in data land, we call it a primary key, or their hierarchies to different groups. We do it with schools sometimes, so maybe we look at one school district, and then we hone in on one school, and then we hone in on one grade, and then one class, and then, one section or something. It's sometimes cheaper to cluster the sample by selecting respondents only from certain areas and then splitting them up again and again, or certain time periods, especially if the data are already kind of set up that way. The weaknesses is it may not be as reliable, and precision over time, if clusters differ each time you sample over and over again, sometimes they change a little bit, because what if that person leaves the cluster and you split it again and they're not in there anymore? That can definitely happen, so you have to kind of be on the lookout for that. So again, no sampling method's perfect. They all have strengths and weaknesses. Systematic samples. This is just kind of a simple way to select every certain number of person, like every 4th person, every 12th person on your list. Make sure your starting point and your whole list is randomized. So of course you wouldn't want to do this in alphabetical order because it's going to make it so certain people are selected more than others, or you have to have a lot of people with S last names or T last names or L last names, it might kind of mess things up. So you want to kind of scramble your list first before you select every 4th person. to be part of your sample in your study. So these can work pretty well, and they're pretty easy to do. So the strengths are, it's useful for sampling from large databases, and you'll get pretty good coverage. Very efficient to gather, just like a simple random sample. Allows for the probability to be present, where people have similar chances for selection once you mix up the list. Everybody gets a chance of being picked. Weaknesses, it can be vulnerable to what we call periodicities, data that occurs at regular intervals or patterns. And so when you kind of see what I call data clumping, things where large numbers of records all kind of swell together, it might not be the best thing to do. So you have to think about that. So if you kind of have unusual things going on in the data, like maybe a high number of records like this, or maybe you're actually sampling dispatch calls, and your dispatch calls are swelling right before a civil disobedience episode, or they're swelling right before a hurricane evacuation, then you're going to have to think about whether that's representative. Maybe that's your target, but maybe it isn't. So you'd have some of those periodicities going on, unique to that period. Quota samples. So quotas are, I want a certain number of this person or this group. You intentionally select people to answer your survey. We also call that a cherry picking your respondents. You're going to sample 200 females, 300 males between the age of 45 and 60 to represent all adults. So, it's not a random way to be selected. You're kind of just finding the first 200 males or 300 males, the first 200 females, with no randomness. Now, this can be helpful with a minority group, because maybe you need a certain number of people with an identity or an attribute, because you want to get a perspective from them. And so you're going to keep on drawing people into your study that meet that criteria, so you can get enough of them to analyze. So yeah, cherry picking is very much that way. But of course, drawbacks to this, right? So it's strength is it's an alternative to random sampling if your product does not allow for this, but you have to be very careful when you use it. You should only use it in rare cases, because judgment selects the respondents from each unit on some criteria you have, and it might be applied inconsistently. So you're not really applying the randomness, which gives you the good prediction power in your sample. You're going to lose that in a quota sample. But sometimes a quota sample is all you have time to do. But you just have to know what you can use it for and its limitations. Weaknesses, the sample is not random, and these samples are a little biased because not everyone has an equal chance of getting in, and you can't generalize it back to the population, but it can give you some topics and ideas to look at later with maybe a larger group. So some people use this as like an exploration sample. That's a possibility. Snowball sample. Existing participants refer others to your survey from among those they know, often used in hidden populations which are difficult to access. So you might have heard of this as opportunity sampling or convenience sampling. So for example, there's a classic study called Armed Robbers in Action. It's by Wright and Decker. Actually, Decker is at Arizona State University in the School of Criminology, but he basically started with a group of armed robbers, active armed robbers on the street, and interviewed all of them, and then said, hey, I'm doing this study of armed robbers. Do you know any other armed robbers which would want to participate? And so basically they got to choose, the robbers themselves, who got included in Wright and Decker's study. So their own referrals are going to be part of what generates the people who participate. So again, it can be useful. It's hard to get a random sample of armed robbers in a survey, especially when they're doing behaviors which are incriminating or sensitive or private, or there are legal consequences for them doing them. They may not want to reveal that they are doing them. They may not feel safe to do so. So this might be the technique you draw from, because that population's hidden. Because of the behavior they're doing. You also see this with things like illegal immigration. You'll find that homelessness, you'll find snowball samples because of the consequences of revealing their identities and so forth. So this can be a helpful sampling technique for that hiddenness that comes up with behavior and lifestyle. So strengths and weaknesses, you can use it for the hidden populations, people that are difficult to find, drug users, robbers, illegal immigrants. You need referrals to find more people, and they all kind of know each other. The weaknesses, these samples are biased because people often add their own selection criteria when giving you referrals. So they're like, oh yeah, Joe would be good to talk to, or you should go talk to Jose, or you should go talk to Mikey. And you're like, well, okay, so you're not in charge of your sample anymore. They are, because they're picking and choosing who they give to you. You can't make generalizations about the population because it really wouldn't be representative enough. You wouldn't get the variety you need in the group because of that. Okay, rounding out samples, we're almost done. Stratified samples. The population is first divided in a subgroup, and people are drawn from each subgroup. So maybe you have a group of supervisors and clerical staff, patrol officers, lieutenants, and whatnot. You can actually randomize within the group to strengthen your sample. So maybe you randomize all the patrol, you randomize all the lieutenants, all the captains, and that's called a stratified sample. And strata comes from geology, the words for layers of rock. And you get kind of different characteristics within each layer, and it recognizes that strata. So that's what it comes from. So you're looking at the kind of different groups or layers within a whole population, and you're randomizing within the group. That's all it is. Strengths and weaknesses. Stratified samples focus on important subpopulation, and it ignores irrelevant ones, so it can kind of get after more of your target. As long as the strata or the groups are proportional to their size in the larger population, you can still maintain a pretty useful level of representativeness for the groups you really want to know about. So you got to be careful that you don't choose more supervisors than what actually would be proportional to the whole population, because that's going to be kind of throwing things off a little bit. Weaknesses, it can increase the cost and complexity of your sampling, so you got to make sure that's in your plan because it takes time to do all the randomness within each group. And you might need a larger sample than other methods would require to make sure you get enough people. So again, you have to look at your time and your resources and what you can do. Convenience sample is the last sample we're going to talk about. The sample is drawn from a part of the population which is close by. So this can be a snowball sample, okay? Participants are selected because they're readily available and convenient, like people within your neighborhood that live next to you to represent everyone in the city. They're at arm's length. This is kind of what we call the person on the street, where you stop and talk to somebody. It's whoever walks by is going to be in your study. They're kind of similar to what the limitation would be to a snowball sample. You can't generalize your findings. They can't really represent everyone accurately because it's susceptible to whoever walks by at that moment, which may or may not be representative. This could be useful if you maybe try to do it on different days of the week, different times of the year, times of the day. That can help, but it's not perfect. So overall, which kind of sample should you use? Well, if your population is really unique or small in number, like Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese females living in Alachua County, then you might want to use a stratified random sample. Maybe group them first and select your people. You have to really look at the characteristics. If a population is pretty small and very accessible, you may not really have to forego drawing. You can forego drawing sample and just survey everyone there. However, sometimes you don't have that time available or money or resources to dedicate to it, so you'll use a sample. But yeah, you just have to look at what's available and how that could work. So kind of in sum, as a sampling exercise, which samples are best? So I'll give you a moment to think about what we just talked about before I provide the answer. Okay, first of all, the gold standard simple random samples. Hopefully you said that first. Stratified samples are also very good, as well as systematic samples. Those have the best value to them as far as investment, what you get in, you get out, accuracy, generalization. Cluster, quota, snowball, and convenience are all more limited. They have drawbacks. But again, all have advantages and disadvantages, and you're just going to have to look at your project and look at what's practical with what you need to get done, but then know how to use the data appropriately. So that wraps up this lecture on sampling. We'll see you in part 3.